What happens when you're faced with failure in business or your personal life? How does God see that? Well, today we're going to look at that through an interview that I did with Davey Blackburn, Nothing is Wasted podcaster. He interviews myself about this important topic and how to find the upside of adversity in your situation. Stay tuned. How do I bring my faith to work? How do I tap into the power of God in my work-life call? Why am I going through this adversity? Is God mad at me? I'm Oz Hillman, and I've been helping leaders like you answer these questions and more for over 30 years. That's what this podcast is all about. Let's learn and grow together. Welcome to TGIF, Today God is First.
Oz is going to unpack this topic and other just issues around what it looks like to fail in leadership and to wrestle with life failures, but then talk about some of the lessons that he learned from that. I think it's a really great conversation that you have with him. So let's go ahead and listen to Davey's interview with Oz Hillman.
Oz, it's so great to have you on the podcast. Thank you for joining me.
Davey, it's a delight to be with you. I read about your story and identify with many of the things you've gone through, but we both had our things to go through.
Yeah. Well, we often talk about that pain is the common denominator of life. And each of us, no matter what we've gone through, we start paying these membership dues to clubs that we don't want to be in by walking through difficult circumstances. And yet, what I love about your story, Oz, and what's provided so much hope for me as I read specifically The Upside of Adversity that you wrote, is that God sees you through those things, and he teaches you some very valuable lessons in the midst of those circumstances, draws you even closer than what you were before you stepped into those circumstances. So the membership dues to that club, they do pay dividends in the spiritual. And,
they make deposits in our life, that we can't appreciate at the time. And we have to go through a process that sometimes is much longer than we want it to be.
Yeah.
But when we get on the other side of it, we can appreciate what God has done through those experiences. And, he raises us. I like to say it's kind of a graduating into the larger story of our life. In order to be used by God in greater ways.
Yeah.
He may not design the pain, but he'll use the pain in our lives.
Wow. Well, Oz, there are going to be so many of our listeners that are familiar with you and your work, but there are probably some that are not. And so would you do this before we dive into your story? Because I want to get into all of the different weeds and, alleyways of your story. But before we do, can you just kind of give us a little bit of context for present day Oz Hillman? What is it that you do? What's your life like right now?
Well, I have an organization called Marketplace Leaders, and what we do is we equip men and women to see their work as a holy calling from God and to help them become change agents in culture. And so we've been helping men and women for the last 25 years understand the role faith plays in their work-life call. And we do that in a lot of different ways.
Wow. That's awesome. Well, there's so much of what you do that stems from, as I understand, from your story and the ups and downs, the journey that you've gone through. And so would you kind of, for those of us who are not familiar with your story, those who are listening, would you just kind of take us on that journey of those mountaintops and valleys that you've experienced starting years back?
Sure. Well, it really began very, very when I was very young, and my dad was killed in an airplane crash when I was 14 years old. We had 4 sisters, and he was very successful in business and kind of, climbing up the ladder. He was a believer, and that really changed things in our family. Although we were a church-going family, my mother, she didn't have as strong a faith before the accident, but after that, the Lord used that in her life to really draw her in a real intimate relationship with him. In fact, he spoke to her one night when she was at the low point of her life, and he said, "Trust me, Lillian." And as a result of that, God really did a deep work in her life. over the next several years, she began trying to reach me. I was in my teens. I was a young golfer at the time. I wanted to play professional golf. I was very good, and I got a golf scholarship to the University of South Carolina. Went to school there. After 4 years, I wanted to play on the tour. I actually moved away from my city to get away from my mom because she was preaching at me, and I just wasn't open to it. I went for a year to another place, and strangely enough, ended up meeting the Lord there through a pastor who knew my family and knew my mom. And so I ended up not getting into golf, would later get into business. And I would have an ad agency in Atlanta for 12 years. And in 1994, what I call my year from hell came. And, my wife and I had struggled in our married life for a number of years. And she came in and said, I want to separate. And I had investments on the East Coast and West Coast of about $500,000. And I get a call from my financial advisor and says, your money's gone. You've been the victim of a, quote, Bernie Madoff type situation. And it was a scam that my advisor didn't know he was being scammed.
Oh, wow.
My vice president left me and took my second largest account. And so within a matter of 3 months, my wife would end up filing for divorce, and life would, change from one place to a whole nother place. And that would usher me into a 7-year season of adversity. And I got down to my last $1,000, and I wasn't sure what was up, and really struggling to know, why God allowed this to happen. And that's the question most of us ask whenever something devastating happens to us. And but 2 years into my adversity, I got an audio tape from a guy named Gunnar Olsson. He was the founder of the International Christian Chamber of Commerce in Sweden. And on the audio tape that I heard by him, he said, God is raising up Josephs all over the world, and it's often signified by them going through extraordinary adversity in their business and personal life. Well, I realized I needed to talk to that man. He had something I needed to know. And I flew up to Washington where he would be. It was 2 weeks later, and he was head of an international organization. And it was a 75-nation conference in Washington, D.C. And he, I don't know why he did it, but he allowed me to come up to his suite that very night of the conference before it started and listen to my story. And he said, as he listened intently to it, he says, you have a Joseph calling on your life. I said, what in the world is a Joseph calling? He says, well, it's a marketplace call to be a physical and spiritual provider to others, to free others, but your life will be earmarked by adversity. And so he unpacked that more for me and took out a napkin, and he said, here's where you are right now, here's the next phase of your journey, and here's the next phase of your journey, if you'll press into me. And that was the key point he emphasized. Well, that day he became my spiritual father in the marketplace, and still is today. I talked to him a few weeks ago. He's 83 years old and has just deposited in my life all these years. And so anyway, 7 years to the month, I had a windfall of money that, a piece of property I was still able to hold on to. I was able to pay, like 3.5 times what I paid for it. And so I was able to pay off all my debts and become debt free. My wife didn't return, but it birthed what I do today. And God would allow me to start writing a daily devotional called TGIF, Today God is First. And basically that devotional was for me to kind of process what I was walking through, looking in the scriptures to say, okay, why did I go through this? What does it say about this? And I would just write it and send it off to my friends. And they began responding and saying this was really helpful. Then a website guy who was a friend of mine, he said, why don't you let me put it on my website, which turned out to be crosswalk.com. And I started hearing from people all over the world saying, you read my mail today right where I'm at. And so now it's in 104 countries, and I've been to 26 countries and written 19 books, all because of a crisis that led me down a path that I never anticipated I would go down.
Wow.
And, I say that God turned my valley of Achor, which it talks about in Hosea 2:15, to a door of hope, a door of hope for myself, and also a door of hope for many others. And so what I realized is that even though Satan tries to steal, kill, and destroy from our lives, God always has the last word, and he will turn whatever pain or crisis or thing that happens in your life into something that can be used. And I like to say he uses that to give us our anointing and have greater influence because we've had victory over a particular area that Satan tried to defeat us in. And it's payback to the enemy for that.
Wow. Yeah, that's so good. It's funny you mentioned just that because I wrote, as you were talking, I wrote down this phrase, suffering is necessary, ? And I just wonder what your thoughts are on that, because it sounds like, this idea of Joseph calling and God leading you through adversity and through struggle to bring you into a place of, ministry and helpfulness and providing hope to other people. It almost seems like suffering, adversity, hardship is necessary for us. How would you comment on that? What's your take as you've kind of looked back on a lot of the adversity that you experienced?
Well, I think it's a little bit of a combination of things. Hebrews says that Jesus had to learn obedience from the things he suffered. Now, if he had to learn obedience by the things he suffered, what does that say about my life?
Yeah.
So I assume, and the scriptures tell us that we're going to face tribulation in our life. The problem comes in when we attribute evil to God, that God is not behind, but we still experience it. And because evil comes into the world because of free will, God gave us free will.
Yeah.
And as a result of that, if evil gets into the heart of man, they can cause a lot of evil and hardship and pain in the world.
Yeah.
But it's rarely by God's hand unless there's a judgment of some kind. So I think that God desires for us to have a blessed life and to live an abundant life. It's interesting that John 10:10 has two mission statements in it. The first part says, Satan comes to steal, kill, and destroy, but Jesus came to give us life and life abundantly. So I think God's heart is for us to be blessed, but he also knows that we're going to experience tribulation, and he'll use that tribulation for greater purposes, not only in our lives, but the lives of other people, so we can identify with other people as well in their own journey.
Wow. Some of the things as I was reading The Upside of Adversity that I just kind of like hit strong in me, especially as I've kind of walked through some difficult trials, but also transitions in life. And even as I would look back on it and say, there are certain failures that I can see in my own life. And I'm sure as people are listening to this, they can look at some failures in their own life that cause almost a hesitation, an insecurity to arise. You look at, with your situation, you walked through this 7-year journey of just adversity, this kind of dark night of the soul, where so much of your business, the things that you were taking on in business, they just began to implode. Did that cause you to did you have to wrestle through this like insecurity of going, man, to step back out in this risk and this faith, and do I have what it takes? And what was it about what God was doing in that season that helped to shape a new kind of stepping out in faith?
Yeah. Well, there was a guy that God sent in my life at that particular time who was a former Vietnam helicopter pilot, and he had a Christian retreat center up in New England and Massachusetts. And he was a hard-nosed northerner that was a combination of Bill Gothard, Omar Bradley, Jeremiah and Isaiah personality mixed in one person. And it was a little bit hard to be around him because he could smell sin from a mile away and he didn't mind telling me. But he was the kind of person that I needed at that time. And he would often say to me, Oz, there's nothing wrong with you. You're just not dead yet. And I said, what are you talking about? Well, you've got this stronghold of insecurity and fear of your life that's driven by performance. And as long as that's going to be there, you're going to have a miserable time and God's not going to bring you out of this pit. And I said, you can't prove that. He said, yes, I can. And so he took me through this little exercise that proved his point. And I realized he was absolutely true, what he was saying to me. And so that was a part of the process for really God to go on deeper into me to bring healing to me in some areas that I needed that were wounds from childhood, really. And I didn't know it. I was just a performance-driven businessman that liked to control people and circumstances,
Yeah.
And because of what happened with our finances when I was young, it created insecurity around that. And so God did this deep healing in my life through that process. It didn't happen overnight, but it certainly, that was a catalyst to take me down a path.
Yeah. Are you able to articulate like what was replaced, in the place of insecurity? What did God replace? Now, obviously, you said it was a long journey. It was a process. So even you just articulating it right now is not necessarily going to cause someone to, oh my gosh, now I'm no longer insecure. I'm able to walk in wholeness and in faith and trust in God. But maybe it might start to unlock something for somebody to go, oh, okay, so this is what it means not to walk in this kind of a fear-based,
Well, see, John 8:32 says the truth shall make you free. And for most of us, especially men, when we come to the awareness of the truth about something in our life that's not working, then that begins a healing process in and of itself. But for me, I was able to go back and realize that when my dad was killed in an airplane crash, the insurance didn't pay off. And my mother, would say things like, we don't have enough money for that. We don't have enough money for that as a teenager. And so I got this subconscious kind of vow and life message that I don't want to ever have to experience that again. It's kind of like what people went through in the Depression. They could never have enough money after the Depression, right? For fear that was going to happen to them again. And so when I became aware that I was living in fear, the opposite of fear is trust and faith. And so when I had my ad agency, I could have $250,000 in the bank and spend the first hour on the toilet sweating about that I didn't have enough money. Now that's a stronghold of fear. So the opposite of that began to change when I began to repent of that and say, Lord, you are my provider. And I renounce that stronghold and I'm going to walk in faith. And so instead of working 50 or 60 hours, I started working 40 hours. That was my faith decision. That was reshaping how I saw things and did things. And I because the stronghold was there, my relationship to people was very tied to how well they did financially. So if an employee failed financially, I would become angry and more controlling. Well, that changed. I began to trust God and realized that, that was a stronghold too. And I began to affirm my people and not make money an issue, even if there was a failure. And so I began to really reshape, Romans 12 says we need to renew our mind. And that's what had to happen with me. I had to renew my mind and I had to move in a new dimension. Now, it's a good thing I did because I didn't know that God was going to lead me into a nonprofit world, that I had to trust God for my resources through donations, which my pride really hated.
Yeah.
But Those are some examples.
Well, I love that one of the things you said tangibly in terms of a faith step for you was cutting, your 60-hour work week down to 40 hours. And I think what that highlights to me is that faith is action. Faith is not just this idea of believing, but it's actually demonstrating, okay, I'm going to trust God's ways. I'm going to trust in him by taking this actual step, making an actual adjustment, which would then lead you into the belief or the heart level understanding of, oh yeah, I can trust God because he's coming through now for me in this.
Well, that's the sanctification process that he calls all of us to. If we just believe something but don't act upon it, and don't change as a result, we're just religious, versus, really having a relationship with God that impacts our life and changes our life.
Well, in a similar vein, Oz, there are a lot of people who've experienced in their past what some people would say, quote unquote, a failed marriage, and would use that as a excuse or a justification as to why they are maybe disqualified from being used by God. How did you wrestle with that?
Wow, that was tough because I'm on my third marriage, and the first one failed because I was a lousy husband. The second one, and I didn't know all this stuff, although I tried to save it, and I went to counseling and so forth. The second one, that was 10 years, was devastating because I really loved her, and we went to spend over $20,000 in counseling, and I'd done a lot of deep work in my own journey.
Yeah.
But she left, and I was so shocked. I would have bet somebody $1 million that could never have happened to us. And that really put me in a really bad place because, I said, maybe some people might forgive the first one, but in ministry, the second one,
right.
I said, I guess that's done. I guess I'm done, And so I had to really just put that on the altar and say, God, I don't know what you want to do with me now, but it is what it is. And I didn't want it. And I have no control over, what has happened here. And so, anyway, so what happened on that is for 7 years, I waited, hoping for a return that she might. I didn't date. I just just prayed. And then, one night the Lord just ministered to me and said, your time of waiting was over. It's time for you to move on. My grace is sufficient for you. And, I was very, very committed to covenant and marriage, and I didn't believe no matter if they left or not. But God had to do a deep work in me just to be open to his grace in a different way. Well, after that night was a night in June, and then in August is when I was asked to speak at this movie preview. The guy who did the movie was a Hollywood movie, was on my board, and he asked me if I'd go downtown and just say a few words. And so I was there, and Pamela was there with a friend, and she got introduced to me, and one thing led to the next, and we were married within 9 months.
Wow.
And we're doing well.
Well, I think what's so beautiful about, that just that trajectory is, we encounter so many people in our ministry that shame paralyzes them. There's two, we could qualify, there's so many different types of pain, but there's two buckets that we kind of put pain in. One is the things that are done to you that you had no control over, right? Other things are your own failures, or the way that you've kind of brought pain on. And so both of those carry with it shame. And often we encounter people where that's the major limiter, the shame that they carry to say, God could never use me because of X, Y, and Z. What's been done to me, what I've done, God can never use me. And your story is a testimony to the fact that no, once you, like what you said, when you put it on the altar and you say, Lord, I'm yours. No matter, I just want to be yours, that he can take any of those situations and his grace rushes in and redeems it and can use it for
I
a blessing.
often say shame says I am a failure, but guilt says I failed. There's godly guilt that the Holy Spirit gives us and says, you just need to repent. But that doesn't make you as a person any less worthy. It just means, you failed. What we need to do is we need to learn to fail forward, and not backward, so that God can use even that failure. And God is, will use that because he's such a redemptive God. And I like to say, only Jesus made plan A. The rest of us, he turned our B plan and C plan into his A plan.
That is so true. That is so true. Jesus is the only one that aced the test, right? Wow. You know what, I'm really curious, and I don't remember off the top of my head if you list these out in the book, but I'd love for you to, if you know them, the phases that your friend shared with you about in this Joseph calling. Did you write about that in the Upside of Adversity, or did you write about that in Joseph Calling, or either one of those? Do you remember what those phases are that he said, hey, here's what you're typically going to, see in one of these Joseph callings? Because I think that might provide a really just helpful and hopeful framework for those of us who find ourselves in the midst of suffering right now.
Well, what he was trying to do was tell me that the process that many of us in business go through, that we're very performance oriented. And so basically he was showing two things on both sides of the page. One was Egypt. Egypt is always representative of the flesh. And, it says in Psalms that we're not to sweat it out, but basically we're to work unto the Lord. And over here is the promised land. So we're really wanting to come out of Egypt and move into the promised land, which is based on obedience and intimacy with God. And so in order to do that, we all have to come to the end of ourselves. There's a process of that. We have to come to the death of ourselves. And, many times I ask people, or people ask me, when is my adversity going to be over? And I say, well, what I found is it's going to start being over when it doesn't matter to you anymore. That you've come to a place of really death in yourself, that you've given it to God. And you're now, I think that when Joseph came to Pharaoh to interpret that dream, I really don't think that he could have cared less what happened there. I think he'd become dead to his whole life. He wasn't striving to make sure he did this properties. He didn't have any idea that Pharaoh could make him number two over the whole land. I mean, that was so far beyond what he would have thought. And so I think that sometimes once we come to the death of ourselves and are able to relinquish our future to his purposes, that's when God can begin to move. Wow. And that's exactly what happened in my situation. For a while there, I was striving to try to get myself out. What do I do here? What do I do that? And finally came to the death of myself. It wasn't long after that things started happening I had no control over. I was not doing anything to make happen, and things just started falling into place. Wow. I had a publisher offer to publish me, and I had never published a book in my life, and that doesn't happen nowadays, and so it's a wonderful journey once you get free.
Yeah. Well, it's funny as you say that, I feel like I related to your story so much, Oz, as I was reading The Upside of Adversity, because my personality is very much a high achieving, goal oriented type personality, and I've always wrestled with and had to really wrestle to the ground my identity being caught up in what I do. And I think that's for so many people. This is so much of the message of Scripture, and even what you were sharing with this idea of Egypt. And what were the Israelites? They were slaves. Well, slaves are not, their identity is wrapped up in what they can produce. And so God had to rescue them out of Egypt and called them sons, and gave them rest in the promised land. And so there's this whole meta narrative that is happening within us of this trying to strip us away from goal orientation. And yet I'm really curious because I find this tension as someone who is, in ministry and trying to help people and trying to build an organization, that I fight this striving mentality and find value in setting goals and dreaming and, having vision and kind of, letting the Lord download vision on me. And yet that seems to be in conflict with what you were just now saying of like, oh, it just kind of comes to you and you don't care about it anymore. And so can you talk about the tension of that? Because I know there's a tension there. I know it's not a either or. As you've wrestled through that, what does that tension look like?
Yeah, well, God calls us to work and work hard. And the difference is, in fact, when I first was struggling with that, I asked my mentor that question. I said, because he said to me one day, he says, Oz, I really fear for you. And I said, why do you fear for me? He says, you're such a good marketer. I fear that you're going to outmarket God. I said, whoa. How do I not do that?
Right. Yeah, that would be my question. It's like, wait a minute, I don't want to do that, but how do I not?
So he said this profound statement. He said, I have to, there are times that I realize I have to withhold my natural gifting to ensure that God is in it. And I said, that's profound, but how in the world do you do that? And so over time, I learned what he meant by that. And basically what he was saying is that, we are called to work hard, but if God tells you to knock on the door 3 times, knock on the door 3 times. Don't knock on it 4, don't knock on it 2, but knock on it 3. And then trust him to open the door. And I had a profound experience with that years ago when I had started getting several of my books published, and I wanted to find a publisher that I could have a long-term agreement with for multiple projects. Yeah. And so I was in my office one day and I received a book in from a publisher, and the author I knew well. And I said, now that's the publisher I need to be with, because I knew the other writers that were with them. And so I sat down and I began to write a letter to the president of that publishing company. And it was as though my fingers stuck to the keypad. I could not write the letter. And I started again. I could not write the letter. I got up the next morning and tried to write the letter, and the same thing happened. I had this check in my spirit: do not write the letter. So this happened for several days that week. And finally I just said, okay, I get the message. I'm not supposed to write a proposal letter to this publisher. I don't know why, but you're not letting me. About 2 months later, I was at the office, the headquarters of this particular person who wrote the book. And I was doing a workshop, and he asked me in for lunch at his office during lunch hour. And so I go in there, and there's a man sitting at the table with us, and it turns out to be the president of that publishing company. And within 5 minutes of our conversation, he says to me, I've been watching you for several years. We'd love to publish anything you'd like to write. And I said, oh, I got it now.
Wow.
My relationship is totally different now, that he wants me versus me promoting myself to him.
Yeah. Wow.
And so, over time, you realize you become more sensitive to that. So it's a lot easier to know when you're striving and when you're trusting.
Wow.
And the combination. I think of it a lot like a baby who's in the crib, and you got that mobile that all these little characters moving around. It's a little bit like that. You got to make sure you're balancing it right.
Wow. Yeah, such a tough tension to manage. You're right, that balancing act of, working hard and stewarding, but not striving, And I think, and to, continue to go along the storyline of Joseph, you see Joseph do this. Like, as he's in the prison, he puts his own name in the hat. Hey, when you get out of this, talks to the cupbearer, when you get out of this, will you mention my name to Pharaoh? Will you put in a good word for me? Right. And then the next verse we see is that he was forgotten. And he was in the prison.
And that tells us a little bit about the condition of his heart.
Yeah.
That he still had a little bit of stuff there of resentment and, striving. And so God had to give him 2 more years to think about it. And then evidently it come to the death of himself. And then God began to move.
Wow. Oz, it's rare that we are able to talk to somebody who has such life experience as yourself. I would be very curious to, if you were talking to, the 30-year-old Oz or the 25-year-old Oz, what would you say to him? How would you try to advise, if you were his mentor, what are the things that you would tell him? Potentially maybe to help him avoid the avoidable pain, but also to advise him on leaning into the process that God has for him, no matter what. What kinds of things would you say to him?
I think I would sit down and let him tell me his life story. Tell me about your childhood. Tell me about the tough things that happened with you. And are there any things that are tough right now that are surfacing? Because when you're young, it's you often don't have enough pain that's motivating you to move in a particular direction. You see, pain is a great motivator for change, and that there's a great statement somebody made that says the pain to remain the same must exceed the pain to change, and that whole idea that there's a place in the foxhole where you're going to be obedient. Yeah. So I think sometimes when we just have little bumps in the road, they're not enough to change our behavior or get us to think about something that needs to change.
Yeah.
So I think that sitting down with somebody and hearing their story, because so many of people's stories, they become the adults they are because of the wounds of childhood that may or may not have been really dealt with at that stage of their life.
Wow. That's so good. And, there's, I think it's encouraging to hear that, you are even now recognizing childhood wounds that, may have been unaddressed, and you're wrestling with those and dealing with those even now and going, oh yeah, this is a result of, how I'm wired right now is a result of this. And this is but that's the deep work that a lot of people don't do. It's the deep work that pain invites us into, kind of stops us.
Yeah. Before you and I got on the call, we were talking about my marriage to Pamela, who had a very, very difficult past, childhood abuse, sexual abuse, went up into her adult years by threat of murder if she told anybody. She dealt with the pain by taking drugs. She started taking drugs at 9 years old. It led to a 35-year cocaine addiction, prostitution, in and out of jail. Came to Christ at 26, but couldn't break the habit. Finally landed her in prison for 18 months. She got completely clean when from that day on, and has never touched a drink or any drugs since then, since 2010. And so when I met her and she told me her story, I said, oh my gosh, I need to run as fast as I can. Not because there was anything wrong with her per se, but I knew from my own history that there was a lot of pain from that experience. And could I deal with that, in a relationship with already having someone, leave me and all of that, all the baggage that goes with some of that.
Right.
But God really ministered to me and says, what makes her sin any greater than yours? And as we began to walk down the path, now I will tell you that our first year was very tough because a lot of those wounds surfaced.
Yeah.
But we persevered, and we both understood that we had to go to the root of some of these things, and we did, and we got healing for that. Now we have a great marriage.
Wow. Yeah, it's my wife and I talk about this a lot because she's got her own story of a painful past, several different major pillars of things that happened to her, and some failures that she feels that she has walked in volitionally in her own life. And then I've got my whole side of pain, and I wrestled with, like, do I want to marry her because she brings a lot of baggage to the equation? Then I was like, wait, I bring a whole lot of baggage to the equation too. We both kind of do. And so we had the same experience and we're new into our marriage. And so we're still seeing things we're having to work through because of some of the trauma that we both faced. But one of the things that I've found is really cool is that we are that trauma or the triggers are surfacing because we're in a space where we feel safe with each other. And the guard is being let down, and so it causes these things to surface, and it can be scary for people. And they go, oh, hold on, and they try to stuff it back down. But in order to find healing from it, you've got to, okay, now as these things are surfacing, let's work through these things and let's address them. And how have you guys maybe strategically or methodically kind of worked through that, especially as you both know, hey, this is what's going to happen? How do you guys work through those things?
Well, one of the things I learned years ago was that whenever someone has a reaction to something that should be a level 2 instead of going to a level 10, in their emotional reaction to something, there's usually pain there that's unresolved. And so that's a signal to me that, okay, they're not really reacting to the situation. They're reacting, something deeper is causing the level of reaction that I'm hearing. And I remember I think it was the first year of our marriage, and we had a disagreement, and I was really hurt by the disagreement, and I felt like I was unjustly judged, and I was the little boy going in the other room pouting, and then the Lord just spoke to me and said, "Go back in there and put your arms around her and ask forgiveness for every abuse that has been at the hands of men." So I hugged her, and she began to weep, and it was a layer of pain there that God wanted me to help bring healing to.
Wow.
But I had to get past my own pride and my own hurt of the words that I had just heard. And so we both have kind of walked through those seasons where we recognize that, we still have things that have happened in our lives that surface, and we need to recognize when the enemy is trying to cause something in our midst. We're very cognizant that Satan wants to steal, kill, and destroy from our lives in marriage, and that he wants to accuse you. He wants to accuse your wife through you, and vice versa. And that we have to cut that. We have to recognize it. And so we often, whenever we see that happening, we immediately just stop and say, we need to pray.
Yeah, wow.
Feel like it? We need to pray. And we just stop. And we just stop whatever's going on and begin to take control of the situation to bring peace back into the conversation. And that requires being intentional. And it also requires being very intentional about forgiveness. My wife is fantastic at forgiving. And once she forgives, she's forgiven. She's not going to hold a grudge. She's not going to pout. It's done. And that's a tremendous quality she has.
Wow. It's really great to have this kind of insight. And one of the things that struck me as you were saying that, I think it's so profound that if we're going to be healers in other people's lives, if we're going to be ministers to other people, we have to be willing to put down our own pride and walk into wounding. We have to be willing to say, you know what, this might hurt a little bit, but in order to help someone else, whether it's your spouse or whether it's someone that you're just ministering to, I'm going to have to kind of get in some of the way of that elevated, level 10, lashing out that you might experience because of someone else's pain, and to be able to have the emotional fortitude to say, all right, I understand there's something deeper here, and so even though this might hurt me a little bit, I'm going to put that aside and I'm going to step in. And it's Jesus, right? By his stripes, we are healed.
Very contrary to human nature.
Yeah. Wow. Oz, this has been fantastic to be able to talk to you. And I would love for our listeners to be able to follow you and what you do. Do you have, some resources, a website? Just tell us how we can kind of continue to follow the things that you're doing, the message that you're carrying.
Sure. One thing I would suggest people is our devotional, TGIF Today God is First. That can be accessed on our website at todaygodisfirst.com. That's todaygodisfirst.com. But we also, we make available a resource that we have done on topics like this called Adversity FAQ, Frequently Asked Questions. But the website is adversityfaq.com, and that's a free resource. It's an e-booklet, and it's many common questions people ask about adversity. And so I've just compiled those over the years, and it should be helpful to your listeners.
Well, that's awesome. That's going to be extremely helpful. And again, thank you so much for the impact you've made in me personally by the things that you're writing, the message that you're carrying. And I know that you today have made a huge impact in so many people as they're listening to this conversation. So thanks so much for joining me.
Yeah, Davey, it's been a pleasure.